The word landed on me like something physical. Not shouted, not whispered, just spoken into a microphone in front of 200 people who all turned at the exact same moment to look at me. Failure. My sister Ingrid said it with a smile. The kind of smile that's been practiced in mirrors. My mother Elaine laughed softly into her champagne flute like she'd just heard the punchline of a joke she'd been waiting all evening to hear. My father Vincent didn't laugh. He just looked at me from across the room with that flat, steady expression he's worn my entire life. The one that says, "You brought this on yourself." I didn't move. I didn't flinch. I sat at my assigned table in the back corner of the Fredericksburg Hill Country Resort ballroom and I felt my phone buzz once against my thigh. I looked down. One message. 3 words. "It's all ready." I set the phone face down on the table. Took one slow breath. And then I made a decision that would unravel 16 years of carefully constructed lies in front of everyone my family had ever tried to impress. Before I tell you what happened next, I need you to understand something. This wasn't a snap decision. This wasn't me losing control or acting out of spite. Everything that happened that night had been building for a long time. And if you've ever been the one in your family that everyone else points to when they need someone to blame, then I think some part of this story is going to feel very familiar to you. If this is the kind of story that makes you feel seen, take a second and subscribe. I share stories like this one regularly and I don't want you to miss what's coming next. My name is Sophie Lawson. I'm 32 years old. I'm a licensed forensic accountant based out of Austin, Texas. And 4 months ago, I sat in the back corner of my sister's graduation celebration while she called me a failure in front of everyone who matters in my family's world. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that my phone had just buzzed with a message that meant I was no longer sitting there unarmed. But to understand why that moment mattered as much as it did, I have to take you back. Not 4 months. Not a year. 16 years. To the summer I was 16 years old and everything in my family quietly, permanently shifted against me. My family is not loud about the way they operate. That's the thing people never understand when I try to explain it. There are no screaming matches in the Lawson household. No plates thrown, no doors slammed, no dramatic confrontations in grocery store parking lots. The cruelty in my family has always been quiet. Administered in small, precise doses. Delivered with a smile and plausible deniability built right in. Growing up in Fredericksburg, a town that runs on old German heritage, hill country tourism, and the kind of social reputation that takes generations to build, appearances were everything to Vincent and Elaine Lawson. My father built Lawson Financial Consulting from a one-room office on Main Street into one of the most respected independent firms in the Texas Hill Country. My mother chaired every committee worth chairing. The Lawson name meant something in that town. It still does. And both of my parents made sure that everything connected to that name reflected accordingly. Ingrid was the reflection they wanted. 3 years younger than me, effortlessly social, the kind of daughter who made parents look good just by existing in a room. She had my mother's ease with people and my father's instinct for knowing which people mattered. I was none of those things. I was the quiet one. The one who spent Friday nights reading case studies and Saturday mornings asking my father questions about his work that he never wanted to answer. I was interested in numbers the way some kids are interested in sports. Obsessively and in a way that didn't translate well at dinner parties. I wasn't difficult. I wasn't rebellious. I was just wrong for the image they were building. The shift happened the summer I was 16. My father's older brother, my Uncle Doyle, passed away from a sudden heart attack in June of that year. He was 61, never married, no children. Doyle and I had always been close in that quiet, unspoken way that sometimes happens between two people in a family who both feel slightly out of place in it. He used to let me sit in his study on holidays while everyone else was outside, and he'd walk me through balance sheets from his property management business like it was the most natural thing in the world to teach a teenager. He left me something in his will. Not a fortune. A small commercial property on the edge of Fredericksburg. A 2-unit building on Llano Street, modest, older, but paid off clean. His attorney called our house 2 weeks after the funeral. My father took the call in his office with the door closed. He came out 20 minutes later and told me that Doyle had meant to update his will and that the property was being folded into the family estate to cover probate costs. He slid a document across the kitchen table and told me to sign. I was 16. I didn't know what half the words meant. But something about the way my mother left the room when he put that paper in front of me made me hesitate. I didn't sign. My father gave me 3 days. Then he stopped paying my enrollment fees at the private academy I'd attended since 6th grade. He didn't announce it. He didn't explain it. I found out when the school called to say my account was past due. When I asked my mother about it, she said, "Your father is under a lot of stress right now, Sophie. Try to be understanding." I was 16 years old and I was being asked to be understanding about being financially leveraged by my own father. I didn't sign the document. 2 months later, I was enrolled in the local public high school and my father had stopped speaking to me directly. He communicated through my mother. Elaine would appear in my doorway with messages delivered in her gentle, reasonable voice. "Your father thinks it would be best if you focused on your studies. Your father feels that you've been ungrateful. Your father wants you to know that the opportunities you've been given are not guaranteed." I finished high school at the public campus. I applied to the University of Texas at Austin on my own. I was accepted. I took out every loan available to me, worked 20 hours a week at an accounting office near campus, and put myself through 4 years without a single dollar from Vincent and Elaine Lawson. Nobody came to my graduation. I stood on that stage in my cap and gown on a May morning and I shook the dean's hand and I walked back to my seat alone. I went home to my studio apartment that night and ate cold Chinese takeout on my bathroom floor because my kitchen table was buried under textbooks I hadn't returned yet. I was 22 years old and I was the proudest I had ever been of anything. My family sent a card. Elaine's handwriting. "We hope you're well." No signature from my father. The years that followed were not easy, but they were mine. I passed my CPA exam at 23. I got my forensic accounting certification at 25. I joined a mid-sized firm in Austin called Draper & Holt and I worked harder than anyone in that building for 4 years straight. At 29 I was promoted to senior associate. I took cases involving financial fraud, estate disputes and corporate audits. I was good at it. Methodical, precise, patient in a way that my childhood had trained me to be without meaning to. I had a small circle of people I trusted. My closest friend and colleague, a man named Terrence Obie who had been my desk neighbor at Draper & Holt since my second week and who had become the kind of person you call at 2 in the morning when everything is falling apart. And I had my Aunt Ruth Ann, my mother's older sister, who had quietly disapproved of how my parents treated me for years and who was the only member of my family who had ever shown up for me without conditions attached. Ingrid, meanwhile, had become everything my parents wanted her to be. She finished a business degree at Texas A&M, came back to Fredericksburg and joined my father's firm as his junior partner. She got engaged at 26 to a man named Carter Albright, whose family owned 3 wineries in the Hill Country and a commercial real estate portfolio that stretched from Kerrville to San Antonio. The Albrights were exactly the kind of family my father had spent 30 years trying to impress. I was not invited to the engagement party. I found out about it from Aunt Ruth Ann, who sent me a photo from the event with a text that said simply, "You deserve to be here." I had not spoken to my parents in 14 months when my phone rang on a Wednesday night in late August and Elaine's name appeared on the screen. I almost let it go to voicemail. But something about the timing made me pick up. She didn't start with hello. She started with, "Ingrid's graduation celebration is in 6 weeks. We'd like you to attend." Her voice was measured, practiced. The same tone she used when she was asking something she already knew the answer to. I said nothing for a moment. Then I asked why. There was a pause. "Your father thinks it would be good for the family image. The Albrights will be there. I want you to think about what that means." I held the phone against my ear and stared at the ceiling of my Austin apartment and felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not anger. Not sadness. Certainty. Because I knew, the way you know things in your body before your brain catches up, that whatever was being planned for that evening was not going to be kind to me. I didn't say yes that night. I told Elaine I would think about it and I hung up before she could add any more conditions to the invitation. Then I sat in my kitchen for a long time with a glass of water I didn't drink and thought about every possible reason my family would want me in that room. Not one of them was good. Vincent and Elaine Lawson did not do anything without a calculated reason behind it. They didn't invite me to Ingrid's engagement party. They didn't call when I got my certification. They didn't send anything when I made senior associate. 14 months of complete silence, and then suddenly they needed me present at the most socially significant event on their calendar that year. The Albrights would be there. That was the detail Elaine had made sure to mention. He hadn't said "we miss you." She hadn't said "Ingrid wants you there." She said "the Albrights will be there and I want you to think about what that means." I thought about it. It meant they needed the Lawson family to look complete. It meant 2 daughters were better optics than one. It meant I was being asked to show up as a prop and smile for people whose opinion my father valued more than he had ever valued mine. I called Terrence the next morning. He was already at his desk when I reached him, which meant he'd been there since 7, which was normal for Terrence. I told him about the call. He listened without interrupting, which was also normal for Terrence. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment and then he said, "Are you going to go?" I said I didn't know yet. He said, "What's pulling you toward it?" I said, "Aunt Ruthann." He understood immediately. Ruthann had been diagnosed with early-stage rheumatoid arthritis the previous spring. She wasn't incapacitated, not even close, but she had mentioned on our last call that the Fredericksburg winters were getting harder on her joints and that she didn't know how many more big family events she'd be able to attend comfortably. If I didn't go to this one, I might not see her in a room full of the people who knew her best for a long time. Maybe ever. That was the honest reason. Not some hope that my family had changed. Not some fantasy about reconciliation over dinner. Terrence said, "Then you go. But you don't go unprepared." "I know," I said. He said, "I mean it, Sophie. You go in knowing exactly what they're capable of and you have something in your back pocket before you walk through that door." "I already know what they're capable of," I said. He said, "Then let's make sure they remember that you do too." I called Elaine back the following evening and told her I would attend. She said good and immediately began outlining expectations. I was to arrive separately from the family. I was not to discuss my work in detail because it would be confusing to the Albrights who wouldn't understand forensic accounting. I was to wear something conservative. I was not to bring up anything about the past. She used the phrase "the past" the way people use it when they mean the things I did that I don't want to be held accountable for. I let her finish. Then I said I'll be there and I ended the call. 3 days later, a garment box arrived at my Austin apartment via courier. Inside was a dress. Pale gray, shapeless, the kind of thing you'd wear to blend into wallpaper. A handwritten card from Elaine. "This will be appropriate for the venue." I left it in the box. I already knew what I was going to wear and it wasn't that. The event was a formal graduation celebration dinner, not just a casual family party. Ingrid had completed her MBA at UT Austin, an accelerated program, and my parents had rented out the private dining wing of the Fredericksburg Hill Country Resort for the occasion. 180 guests. Hill Country business community, Albright family connections, town council members, the Lawson financial client roster. It was less a graduation dinner and more a coming-out party for Ingrid as Vincent Lawson's fully installed successor. I looked up the venue. I looked up the guest list as much as I could piece it together from Ruthann, who had been given a formal printed invitation and shared the details with me over the phone. And then I started paying attention to something else. A name that appeared twice in what Ruthann described. Holt. As in Gerald Holt. As in the senior founding partner of Draper and Holt, the firm where I had worked for the past 7 years. I pulled up the Albright family's commercial real estate portfolio online. It took me 20 minutes of searching through county records and business filings before I found it. The Albright Group had been in preliminary negotiations with Lawson Financial Consulting for the past 8 months over a joint investment vehicle tied to a series of Hill Country commercial properties. The deal was significant. Multi-million-dollar territory. And the legal and financial oversight on the Albright side was being handled through a referral network that traced back 2 steps removed to Draper and Holt. Gerald Holt wasn't just a name on a guest list. He was connected to the single most important business deal my father had ever attempted to close. I sat with that information for a long time. I wasn't Vincent Lawson. I didn't think in terms of leverage and angles and what I could use against people. That was my father's language, not mine. But I filed it away the way I filed everything. Carefully. Quietly. Because I had learned a long time ago that information has a way of becoming relevant at exactly the moment you least expect it. 2 weeks before the event, Vincent called me directly. He never called me directly. It was always Elaine who made contact, Elaine who delivered the conditions, Elaine who managed the communication while my father sat somewhere offstage pulling the strings. So when his name appeared on my screen on a Sunday afternoon, I felt something cold move through my chest before I even answered. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. He said, "I need you to understand how this evening needs to go." I said nothing. He said, "The Albrights are traditional people. They value family stability. You are going to be present, you are going to be pleasant, and you are not going to say anything that makes this family look dysfunctional." I said, "You mean I'm not going to tell the truth?" There was a pause. The kind of pause my father used when someone said something he hadn't prepared a response for. Then he said, I mean, you are going to behave like an adult and support your sister on an important night. I said, you didn't support me on my important nights. Another pause, longer this time. He said, that's not what this call is about. I said, I know exactly what this call is about. I'll be there. And then I hung up, something I had never done to my father in my life. My hands were shaking when I set the phone down. But it wasn't from fear. It was from something that had been sitting in my chest for 16 years, finally deciding it was done being patient. That same week, Terrence came over to my apartment on a Thursday evening with his laptop and a folder he'd put together without me asking him to. He spread it out on my kitchen table. He had been doing his own research, the way Terrence did things, methodically and without fanfare. He had pulled together a timeline of my professional record. Every case I had led at Draper and Holt. Every certification. Every commendation. The fraud case I had cracked open 2 years prior that had recovered $4.2 million for a nonprofit whose board had been systematically looted by its own treasurer. The corporate audit that had resulted in 3 executive terminations and a complete financial restructuring of a regional logistics company. My work, documented, sourced, factual. He had built it into a clean presentation. 15 slides. Simple formatting. No dramatic language. Just the record, laid out so clearly that there was no room for anyone to argue with it. I looked at it for a long time. Then I looked at him. He said, you're not walking into that room as the family disappointment. You're walking in as the most accomplished person in it. We just need to make sure that if they decide to make tonight about who you are, they're working with accurate information. Terrence had a contact. A woman named Diana Reyes who ran AV and event production for corporate functions across the Hill Country. She had done work for Draper and Holt twice before. He called her that Friday. The Fredericksburg Hill Country Resort had contracted her company for the graduation dinner. Full production setup. Projector, sound, display screens at the front of the private dining wing. Diana confirmed she was short one technician for the evening and that Terrence could fill the slot as a contracted assistant. By Saturday he was confirmed. He would be inside that room with direct access to the display system before any of the guests arrived. He gave me one instruction. Keep your phone on. When you're ready, send me one message. Just the word go. And whatever they put on that screen, I can replace it in under 10 seconds. I copied the presentation onto a drive and handed it to him on Sunday evening. He held it for a moment and then said, you're sure? I said, I'm not sure about anything yet. If they keep it clean tonight, I won't send it. I'm giving them every chance to just let it be a normal evening. He nodded slowly. Then he said they won't. I know, I said. But I need to be certain before I do anything. The morning of the event I put on my burgundy dress, picked up my keys and drove southwest toward Fredericksburg. Fredericksburg in late October sits under a particular kind of sky. Wide, pale blue, the kind that makes everything underneath it look more permanent than it is. The hill country had already started turning, cedar and oak going amber along the ridgelines, the air carrying that clean mineral smell that comes off the limestone after a cold night. I had grown up under that sky. I had driven away from it at 18 with nothing, and I had not missed the town itself, not exactly, but I had missed the land. The way it sat still and indifferent to everything happening on top of it. I pulled off Highway 290 into Fredericksburg just after 4 in the afternoon and drove past Main Street without stopping. Past the storefront where my father's office used to be before he moved to a larger building on the north end of town. Past the Lutheran church where my parents had been photographed for the Fredericksburg Standard's annual community feature 3 years running. Past all of it without stopping and checked into a hotel on the edge of town that had nothing to do with my family or anyone connected to them. I had 2 hours before the event started. I sat on the edge of the hotel bed and called Aunt Ruth Ann. She picked up on the second ring the way she always did, like she'd been waiting. He said, "You're here." I said, "I'm here." She said, "Good." Then she said, "I need to tell you something before tonight and I need you to listen without interrupting me." I said, "Okay." She told me that 3 days earlier, Ingrid had called her to ask whether she thought it was too mean to include a certain segment in the evening's program. Ruth Ann had asked what segment. Ingrid had described it as a family reflection piece, a humorous look at where the Lawson daughters had ended up. Ruth Ann had told her it was a bad idea. Ingrid had laughed and said it was just a joke and that Sophie always took everything too seriously anyway. Ruth Ann had pushed back harder. Ingrid had ended the call. I sat with that for a moment. Not surprised. Not even particularly angry in the sharp, hot way I might have been years ago. Just confirmed. The thing I had been preparing for was real. It was already built. It was already loaded. All it needed was an audience and a microphone. Ruthann said, "I'm going to be in that room tonight and I want you to know that whatever happens I am on your side." I said, "I know." She said, "Hold your head up from the moment you walk in. Don't shrink for them. Not tonight." I said, "I won't." I arrived at the Fredericksburg Hill Country Resort at 6:15. The private dining wing had its own entrance off the west side of the main building, a set of heavy oak doors propped open and flanked by tall arrangements of white flowers and eucalyptus. A handwritten sign on a standing easel read, "Celebrating Ingrid Lawson MBA." Guests were already filtering in. I recognized faces from my childhood. People who had been at my parents' dinner parties, on committees with my mother, in business with my father. Some of them glanced at me with that particular kind of recognition that isn't quite warm and isn't quite cold. The kind that means they know exactly who I am and are waiting to see how the evening positions me before deciding how to react. I gave them nothing. I walked in straight and found my seat. My assigned table was near the back of the room, close to the service corridor. 6 seats, 4 of them filled with people I had never met. A couple from Kerrville who appeared to be distant Albright family connections. A retired accountant from Harper who had been a Lawson Financial client for years and spent the first 10 minutes of the appetizer course explaining to anyone who would listen that he had known Vincent since the man was a junior associate at someone else's firm. I introduced myself as Sophie. Just Sophie. Nobody at that table knew my professional name or my firm, and I kept it that way. I ate my salad. I watched the room. Terrence was stationed near the back wall beside the AV setup, dressed in dark slacks and a black collared shirt that matched the rest of the event staff. We did not acknowledge each other. We had agreed on that in advance. He was a technician. I was a guest. That was all anyone needed to see. The Albright family occupied the 2 center tables nearest the front. Gerald and Patricia Albright, Carter's parents, were exactly what I had expected. Polished, measured, the kind of wealthy that doesn't need to announce itself because the room already knows. Gerald Holt sat 2 seats down from Gerald Albright, which told me everything I needed to know about how important this evening was to my father's business ambitions. Holt was in his late 60s, silver-haired, the kind of man who listened more than he spoke and whose silences carried more weight than most people's sentences. I had worked under his firm's umbrella for 7 years without ever being in the same room as him. I kept my eyes moving and my expression neutral. Ingrid held court near the entrance with Carter at her side, greeting guests with the ease of someone who had been rehearsing this role her entire life. She was wearing a white dress that stopped just short of being a bridal statement. When she saw me, she smiled. A specific kind of smile. The kind that meant she was glad I was there, but not for any reason I was going to enjoy. My mother appeared at my elbow before the first course was cleared. She had that particular energy she carried at social events, stretched thin under the surface, every word calibrated. She leaned down slightly and said in a low voice, "You look nice." Then she looked at my dress and her expression flickered for just a fraction of a second. I had not worn the gray. She recovered immediately and said, "Stay at your table during the program. Don't make anything awkward." I smiled the way she had taught me to smile at events when I was 12 years old. Pleasantly. Without showing anything. She moved away and I watched her cross the room to reposition herself near the Albrights, shifting back into hostess mode like changing a channel. My father was at the front of the room talking to Gerald Albright with the focused intensity he reserved for conversations that mattered to his bottom line. He had not looked at me since I walked in. The program started at 7:30. A catering manager dimmed the lights over the tables while leaving the front of the room illuminated. Ingrid's best friend from A&M, a woman named Bree with a practiced MC's voice, took the standing microphone and welcomed everyone to the celebration. There were toasts from Carter, from 2 of Ingrid's MBA classmates, from a professor who had apparently been very moved by Ingrid's thesis on regional investment strategy. Each toast drew warm applause. My father stood briefly and gave a short speech about legacy and the pride of watching your child build something that will outlast you. He did not mention me. The omission was deliberate and architectural, and everyone at the front tables accepted it without question. Then Bree returned to the microphone and said, "And now we have a special segment that Ingrid put together herself. A little look at the Lawson family and how far they've all come." There was a warm murmur from the crowd. The display screens at the front of the room flickered on. The first slides were straightforward. Baby photos of Ingrid. Childhood scenes. A photo of my parents on their wedding day. Ingrid at her high school graduation. Ingrid at A&M. Ingrid and Carter at a vineyard at Christmas at a gathering somewhere with a lake in the background. Each slide drew applause or laughter at the right moments. The whole thing was smooth and well produced, and I sat at my table in the back and waited. Because I knew what was coming. The segment wasn't finished with just Ingrid. Then the tone of the music shifted. Something lighter, slightly comedic, the kind of underscore that signals a punchline is approaching. Bree said, "Of course, every family has its full picture. And the Lawsons are no different." The screen changed. A photo of me appeared. An old one, taken when I was in my early 20s before I had built anything or passed any exam or won any case. I looked young and uncertain in it, and that was clearly why it had been chosen. Across the bottom of the slide, in clean bold font, the word underachiever. Scattered laughter from the crowd, the polite reflex kind. The next slide loaded. A graphic of a diploma with a question mark where the institution's name should have been. The caption read, "Still figuring it out." More laughter, looser now, feeding on the permission of the first reaction. Kept my face completely still. The next slide. A cartoon of a person sitting alone at a desk surrounded by stacks of paper. The caption read, "The family's favorite cautionary tale." The laughter was real now, coming from multiple tables. Ingrid was smiling from her seat at the head table. Not laughing. Smiling. Watching me with the focused pleasure of someone who had been waiting a long time for this specific moment. My mother had her wine glass at her lips, and her eyes were moving between me and the room with the calm calculation of someone monitoring whether their plan was working. My father had not turned around once. I looked down at my phone. The message to Terrence was already typed. One word. Go. My thumb hovered over the send button. I had made myself a promise. I was going to give them every chance. I looked back at the screen. The next slide was loading. I watched it appear. A split image. On the left, Ingrid's MBA diploma, framed and lit like an award. On the right, a blank frame with a single word centered inside it. Nothing. The room went quiet for just a second, the way rooms do when something crosses from uncomfortable into genuinely wrong and the audience feels it before they can name it. Then someone laughed anyway, and the moment cracked open and the word sat there on that screen in front of everyone my family had spent 30 years impressing. I looked at it for exactly as long as it took me to be completely certain. Then I pressed send. 10 seconds. That was all it took. The display screens at the front of the Fredericksburg Hill Country Resort flickered once, went black for exactly 2 heartbeats, and then came back up with something entirely different on them. The laughter in the room died the way laughter does when the thing that was funny stops being funny mid-breath. Not gradually. All at once. Like a switch. The new slide was clean. White background. A professional headshot of me that Terrence had pulled from the Draper and Holt Company website. Below it, in simple dark type for lines. Sophie Lawson. Senior Associate, Draper and Holt Financial Investigations. Licensed Forensic Accountant, State of Texas. Certified Fraud Examiner. Nobody laughed. Nobody made a sound. The room recalibrated in real time, and I could feel it happening from my table in the back corner. The collective shift of 180 people updating their understanding of exactly who had been sitting at table 7 next to the service corridor all evening. Bree stood at the microphone with her hand still raised from her last gesture and her expression frozen somewhere between confusion and alarm. She looked toward the back of the room where the AV setup was. Terrence was not looking at her. He was looking at the screen with the neutral attentiveness of a technician doing his job. Ingrid was on her feet. She said something sharp to Carter, who put his hand on her arm. She pulled free. My mother set her wine glass down with a precision that told me she was measuring every movement. My father turned around for the first time all evening and looked directly at me across the full length of the room. The second slide appeared. A list. Clean, numbered, factual. Cases led at Draper and Holt Financial Fraud Recovery. Total value returned to clients over 7 years. $4.2 million in a single nonprofit case alone. Awards and commendations. The Forensic Accounting Certification. The CPA. The University of Texas degree. Every credential listed with its date and issuing institution. A man at the table nearest the front leaned toward the woman beside him and said something I couldn't hear. She nodded slowly. Gerald Holt had not moved. He was reading the screen with the focused attention of a man who processes information for a living and does not waste that attention on things that don't merit it. Ingrid found her voice. She stepped away from the head table and said loudly enough for the nearest third of the room to hear, "This is not part of the program." She looked toward Bree. "Turn it off." Bree looked back at the AV booth and made a cutting gesture across her throat. Terence glanced at her, nodded as if acknowledging the request, and did nothing. The third slide loaded. A single quote in large centered text. "The integrity of financial records is the foundation of every institution that handles other people's trust." Below it, the source. Sophie Lawson, Draper and Holt Client Presentation, Harris County Nonprofit Fraud Case 2022. It was something I had said in a deposition summary that Terence had found in a case file he had legitimate access to. Seeing it on a screen in that room in front of those people felt like watching a version of myself I had built quietly and alone finally walk into a space that had been deliberately closed to her. My father moved. He came down the center of the room the way he moved through every room he considered his, with the assumption that space would clear for him. It did. Guests at the aisle tables shifted back slightly without being asked. He reached my table in under a minute and he looked down at me with an expression I had only seen on his face twice before in my life. Once when I refused to sign the document at 16. Once when I hung up the phone on him 2 weeks ago. He said, "Shut this down right now." His voice was low, controlled, the version of quiet that in our house always preceded something worse. I looked up at him. I said, "I didn't start it, Vincent." He said, "I am telling you to end this." I said, "You told Bree to end it and that didn't work either." Something moved behind his eyes. He straightened. He said, "You are embarrassing this family in front of people who matter." I said, "You embarrassed me in front of the same people 20 minutes ago and called it a joke." The fourth slide was on the screen now. I hadn't looked yet. I knew what it was because Terence and I had built it together on my kitchen table and I had approved every word on it. But I watched my father's eyes move to the screen and I watched his face when he read it. The slide said in clean paragraph text the following. For 16 years the Lawson family told this town that Sophie was a dropout, a failure, a cautionary tale. She was not. She built her career without their support, their money, or their name. She did it anyway. My father's jaw tightened in a way I had never seen before. Not anger exactly. Something that sat underneath anger and was heavier and older. He said, "You have no idea what you're doing." I said, "I know exactly what I'm doing. For the first time in my life I actually do." Carter stood up from the head table. He was quieter than Ingrid, more measured, and I had the sense watching him that he was a man who had just attended an event expecting one thing and received something considerably more complicated. He said, "Can we pause for a moment?" He wasn't directing it at me. He was directing it at the room, at Ingrid, at Vincent. A small reset request from someone who hadn't signed up to be in the middle of any of this. Ingrid turned on him immediately. "Don't," she said. He looked at her steadily. He said, "Ingrid." He said, "This is my night." He said, "I know." She said, "She is ruining it." He was quiet for a beat. Then he said, "Ingrid." He said, "Don't." He said, "She didn't make the slideshow." Ingrid's mouth opened. Nothing came out. It was the first time I had ever seen my sister without a ready response, and the silence she left behind was more revealing than anything she could have said to fill it. Gerald Holt stood up. He did it the way he did everything, without announcement, without drama, simply as a fact. He picked up his water glass, which he had been nursing since the appetizer course, and he walked from his table toward mine. Not toward the front of the room. Not toward Vincent. Toward me. The room noticed. When a man like Gerald Holt moves through a room with intention, people track it the way they track weather. He stopped at my table. He looked at me with the direct, evaluating attention of someone who has spent 40 years in financial investigation and knows what competence looks like when he sees it. He said, "Draper and Holt. The Harris County case." I said, "Yes." He said, "I read the case summary when it was published in the Investigative Finance Journal. I didn't connect the name until just now." I said nothing. He said, "That was significant work." I said, "Thank you." He said, "Are you currently taking on external clients?" I said, "I'm senior associate, so case intake goes through the firm's partners." He nodded. He said, "I'd like to have a conversation with Gerald Draper next week." Then he turned and looked at Vincent Lawson, who was still standing at the end of my table with his hands at his sides. Holt said, "Vincent." My father said, "Gerald." The two men looked at each other for a moment the way men look at each other when they are both recalculating simultaneously. Then Holt said, "We'll talk." And he walked back to his table. Not to the Albright table. To his own. And he sat down and he looked at the screen where my credentials were still displayed and he took a slow sip of his water. My mother appeared from the left side of the room. She had been moving through the edges of the space, working the perimeter the way she always did at events when something wasn't going according to plan, trying to manage the narrative in small clusters before it solidified into a single story. She reached me and she said in a voice stripped of its usual social coding, "Thea, you need to stop this." I looked at her. I said, "My name is Sophie." She blinked. I said, "You've called me Thea since I was 3 years old because you thought Sophie was too plain for the Christmas card. I told you I hated it when I was 8. You kept doing it anyway." She opened her mouth. I said, "That's fine. It doesn't matter anymore. But my name is Sophie. In this room and everywhere else." She closed her mouth. She looked around at the tables nearest us, where conversations had stopped and people were openly listening. Her social instincts fired immediately and I watched her face shift into damage control mode, the practiced composure reassembling itself in real time. She turned to the closest table and smiled her hostess smile and said, "Family dynamics." She laughed lightly. Nobody laughed back. Aunt Ruthann was already on her feet. She had been sitting 3 tables away from mine all evening, quiet and watchful, and I had not seen her move until she was beside me. She put her hand on my shoulder. Not a restraining touch. A standing with you touch. She looked at my mother and she said, "Elaine, the only thing happening here tonight is that your daughter is telling the truth. That is not an emergency." My mother looked at her sister with an expression that contained 30 years of complicated history in it. Then she looked away. Ruthann squeezed my shoulder once and stayed where she was, standing beside me in the back corner of the room while the screen at the front continued to glow with the record of everything I had built without anyone in this family's help. I had not planned to say anything. I had planned to let the slides do it. But I was standing now and the room was quiet, and for the first time in as long as I could remember, I had something my family had never once given me in this town. The floor. I want to be clear about something before I tell you what I said. I'm not a person who makes speeches. I don't rehearse things in bathroom mirrors or imagine moments of confrontation playing out in my favor. I spent 16 years not saying the thing I needed to say because saying it had always cost me more than staying quiet. I had lost my school enrollment. I had lost my tuition. I had lost a front door that would open for me without conditions attached. I had learned early and thoroughly that in the Lawson household, truth was something you kept to yourself if you wanted to keep anything else. So when I say that I stood in that room and spoke, I want you to understand what it cost me to get to the point where I could do it. Not courage exactly. Something quieter than courage. The simple exhaustion of having stayed silent for so long that silence had stopped protecting me and started just hurting. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't address the room like someone making a toast or delivering a verdict. I just stood where I was and I spoke at a volume that the people nearest me could hear clearly, which in that particular silence turned out to be most of the room. I said, "I'm not going to take up much of your evening. Most of you don't know me. I'm Sophie Lawson. Vincent and Elaine's older daughter. The one they didn't mention in the program." I paused for just a moment. Not for effect. As I needed to breathe. I said, "I left Fredericksburg at 18 with $43 in one bag. Not because I wanted to. Because my father told me to leave and made it clear there was nothing here for me if I didn't sign over a property that my uncle had left specifically to me." I heard a chair shift somewhere in the room. Kept going. "I didn't ask for any of this tonight. I came because Aunt Ruthann is important to me and because I thought even after everything, that maybe one evening could just be an evening." I looked directly at Ingrid. It couldn't. So now you know who I am. Not the version on the slides they made. The actual version. Ingrid stepped forward. Her voice had lost its earlier sharpness and what replaced it was something I recognized from our childhood. The wounded register she deployed when she needed the room to feel sorry for her. She said, "You came here to humiliate me. On my night." I looked at her steadily. I said, "You put the word nothing on a screen next to my name in front of your fiancé's family and your father's business contacts. You did that, Ingrid." "Not me." She said, "It was a joke." I said, "You built it in advance. You chose the photos. You wrote the captions. You timed it for the moment in the program when the most important people in the room were watching. That's not a joke. That's a plan." Her jaw tightened. She looked at Carter. Carter was not looking back at her. He was looking at the floor with the careful stillness of a man doing a significant amount of private thinking in a very public setting. Patricia Albright, Carter's mother, leaned over and said something quietly to her husband Gerald. He listened, nodded once, and then both of them looked at Vincent. It was the kind of look that doesn't require words because the message is already fully formed and everyone in range of it can feel exactly what it contains. My father felt it. I watched him feel it. He turned toward the Albrights with his client-facing expression assembled and said, "Patricia, I want to assure you that this is not reflective of how we conduct ourselves." Patricia Albright said, "Vincent, I've just watched you sit silently for 20 minutes while your daughter was mocked on a screen at a family event. That is exactly how you conduct yourself." She said it without heat. That was the thing about it. She wasn't angry. She was just accurate, the way a person is accurate when they have been watching closely and have finally seen enough to form a conclusion. Vincent turned back to me. The client-facing expression dropped. What replaced it was something rawer, stripped of the social scaffolding he had been operating behind all evening, and underneath it I could see what I had always known was there but had never quite been able to see this clearly. Not just the cold authority. The fear. My father was afraid of me. Not physically. Not even strategically, not exactly. He was afraid of what I represented, which was the version of the Lawson family story that his own daughter had been living for 16 years outside of his control and outside of his narrative. A story he had tried to edit down to nothing. A story that had refused to stay edited. He said, "You were given every opportunity." I said, "I was given conditions." "There's a difference." He said, "You threw your future away over a piece of land." I said, "You threw your daughter away over a piece of land." The room went so quiet I could hear the ventilation system running above the chandeliers. My mother made a sound. Not a word. Just a sound. The kind that comes out when something that has been held in for a very long time finally slips through a gap in the composure. Ingrid tried once more. She moved toward Carter and took his arm and she said to the room, "I think we should all just take a breath. This has gotten completely out of hand and I'd like to get back to celebrating what tonight is actually about." Carter looked at her hand on his arm. He looked at her face. He said, "Ingrid, did you know about the property?" She said, "What?" He said, "The Llano Street property. Your uncle's estate. Did you know your father tried to force Sophie to sign it over at 16? She was quiet for 2 full seconds. I counted them. Then she said, "That was a long time ago." He said, "That's not an answer." She said, "It was a family matter." He said, "It's still not an answer." She let go of his arm. He stepped back. Not dramatically. Just one step. But in that room at that moment it was the most significant piece of movement I had witnessed all evening. Gerald Holt spoke from his table. He hadn't moved from his seat since he'd come to speak to me earlier, and his voice carried easily in the silence. He said, "Vincent, the referral partnership we discussed for the Albright account." He paused just long enough for my father to look at him with full attention. "I'll need to revisit that timeline." My father said, "Gerald." Holt said, "I'm not saying no. I'm saying I need to revisit it. There's a difference." He used my exact words back at my father without looking at me, and I understood from the precision of it that Gerald Holt was a man who listened to everything, remembered everything, and made his points with the minimum number of words required to make them land. Ruthann had not moved from beside me through any of this. At some point during the last several minutes, 2 other women had stood up from their tables and positioned themselves nearby without making a production of it. A woman named Carla who I remembered vaguely as one of Ruthann's longtime friends, and an older woman I didn't recognize who had apparently known my Uncle Doyle and had come tonight as a courtesy to the family. Neither of them said anything. They just stood in the general vicinity of where I was standing. It was the quietest and most powerful thing anyone did all night. My mother noticed it. I watched her notice it. She looked at those 3 women standing near her oldest daughter in the back corner of her meticulously arranged evening, and something shifted in her face that I don't have a clean word for. Not guilt, not exactly. Something older and less resolved than guilt. The look of a person confronting the gap between who they intended to be and who they actually were, and finding the gap too wide to talk their way across in a single evening. I picked up my bag from the back of my chair. I straightened my dress. I looked at my father, at my mother, at Ingrid, each in turn, and I said the thing I had been carrying for 16 years in the space where a family was supposed to be. I said, "I didn't come here tonight looking for an apology. I don't expect one and I'm not waiting for one. But I want you to know that I am done being the story you tell when you need to explain why things went wrong. I built a life. A real one. Without your money, without your name, without your permission. And I am proud of it in a way that has nothing to do with whether or not you are. I looked at Ingrid one last time. He was crying. Real tears, not the performed kind from earlier, the kind that come when something you've been pretending isn't true stops being possible to pretend. I said, I hope you figure out who you are without me as a reference point, Ingrid. I genuinely do. Then I looked at Carter and I said, I'm sorry your evening went this way. He said, don't be. I think I needed to see it. Then I thanked Ruthann, who squeezed my hand and whispered, that's my girl, which broke something open in me that I didn't let show until I was outside. I walked through the dining room, past the tables, past the guttering candles and the half-finished dessert plates, past the display screen where my credentials were still glowing in clean white text against the dark, and I pushed open the heavy oak doors and stepped out into the October night. The parking lot of the Fredericksburg Hill Country Resort was half empty. The early leavers had already gone, couples who had made their polite exits while the room was still sorting itself out, people who had attended for the Albrights or for Lawson Financial and had no appetite for staying once the social calculation shifted. I sat in my car with the engine off. The Hill Country night was clear and cold, the kind of cold that comes fast in October once the sun drops behind the ridgeline, and through the windshield I could see the light from the resort's entrance casting long pale rectangles across the limestone gravel of the lot. I wasn't shaking. I wasn't crying. I was just very still, the way you get still after something that has been in motion for a very long time finally stops. Terrence came out 15 minutes later still wearing the AV company polo, carrying 2 coffees from the resort's lobby. He knocked on the passenger window. I unlocked the door. He got in, handed me one and sat back without saying anything immediately, which was exactly right. We sat in silence for a while. The lobby doors opened and closed a few times. Then Gerald and Patricia Albright came out, walking close together, Patricia with her hand in her husband's arm, both of them moving with the deliberate quiet of people who have processed something and arrived at a shared conclusion. They didn't look toward the parking lot. They got into a black SUV and left. Then Carter came out alone. He stood on the steps for a moment looking at his phone, then he looked up at the sky, then he went back inside. Terrence said, how are you doing? I said, I don't know yet. He said, that's honest. I said, I meant every word I said in there. He said, I know. That's why it landed. My phone started buzzing around 9:45. Not calls. Messages. The first was from Ruthann, sent from inside the venue while she was still at her table. It said, I have never been more proud of anyone in my entire life. Then a message from a number I didn't have saved. It took me a moment to realize it was Carter. He had gotten my number from Ruthann, which told me he had gone back inside specifically to ask for it. The message said, I want you to know that I spoke to my parents before they left. They have a clear picture of what happened. I'm sorry it took seeing it in person for me to understand what Ingrid had told me about you versus what was actually true. I held my phone for a moment after reading that. Not because it surprised me. Because it was the first time in 16 years that someone connected to my family had looked at the 2 versions of the Sophie Lawson story and chosen the accurate one without being forced into it. I didn't respond to any of the messages that night. I drove back to my hotel, took a long shower and slept better than I had in months. The weeks that followed moved quietly. Not dramatically, not in the way the evening itself had moved, but with the steady momentum of consequences working through a system that had been under pressure for a long time. Terrence reported that Gerald Holt had called Gerald Draper the following Monday morning. The call lasted 40 minutes. Draper called me into his office that Tuesday and told me with the particular suppressed excitement of a man who valued understatement that Holt was interested in bringing Draper and Holt on as the primary financial investigations firm for a new Albright Group oversight initiative. The client specifically requested that I be the lead associate on the account. I sat across from Draper's desk and kept my expression professionally neutral for the duration of the meeting and then went to the bathroom and stood at the sink for 2 full minutes with my hands under cold running water just to feel something grounded and real. Lawson Financial Consulting did not collapse. My father was too entrenched in Fredericksburg for a single evening to dismantle 30 years of business relationships. But the Albright joint venture, the deal that was supposed to be the signature achievement of his career's final chapter, did not proceed. Gerald Albright sent a formal letter to Lawson Financial 2 weeks after the graduation dinner citing a strategic realignment of their investment priorities. The language was impeccable, professional, unimpeachable and completely final. My father had spent 3 years cultivating that relationship. It was gone in a paragraph. I did not feel triumphant when I heard this. What I felt was tired and sad in the particular way you feel when something that should never have needed to happen finally does. Sad not for my father's loss but for the version of our family that had never existed and now never would. Ingrid called me 5 weeks after the dinner. She sounded like someone who had been doing a lot of sitting alone in a room thinking, which turned out to be accurate. She told me that Carter and she were in couples counseling and that one of the first things the counselor had asked them to do individually was to write down the stories they had been told about the people in their lives and examine where those stories came from. She said she had written 3 pages about me and that when she looked at what she had written she didn't recognize the person on the page as anyone she had actually known. She said, "I don't think I ever actually knew you." I said, "You knew the version of me that was useful to the family story." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I'm sorry for the slideshow." I said, "I know." She said, "That's not enough." I said, "No, it's not. But it's a start." We talked for 22 minutes. We didn't make plans. We didn't promise anything to each other. But we stayed on the phone for 22 minutes and neither of us hung up early, which for us was something entirely new. My father sent an email 6 weeks after the dinner. 4 sentences. He said he had been thinking about what I said. He said he understood that I felt the property situation had been handled incorrectly. He said he hoped I was well and that he was open to a conversation when I was ready. I read it 3 times. I didn't respond for 2 weeks. Then I wrote back 2 sentences. I said, "I appreciate you reaching out. I'm not ready yet but I'll let you know when I am." It was the most honest thing I had ever said to him and I sent it before I could edit it into something more or less than what it was. My mother's version of an apology arrived through Ruthann on a Sunday morning. Ruthann said, "Your mother asked me to tell you something. She said she's ashamed of herself. Not of you, of herself." I said she could tell me that directly. Ruthann said, "I know." I said, "Has she thought about doing that?" Ruthann said she's working up to it. I said, "I'll be here when she does." And I meant it. Not because everything was forgiven. Not because one dinner had repaired 16 years. But because I had spent those 16 years carrying a door that only I was holding closed and I was tired of the weight of it. The door could be open. What walked through it and when was still to be determined. The Llano Street property is still in my name. I drove past it on my way out of Fredericksburg the morning after the dinner without stopping. It's a 2-unit building, older, the kind of structure with good bones under neglect. A local property manager had been collecting modest rent on behalf of my uncle's estate administrator, who had listed me as owner of record and simply never been instructed otherwise. I had been receiving small quarterly deposits into a holding account for 3 years without fully registering what they were. When I finally looked at the account balance, it was enough to cover a significant renovation. I've been in contact with a contractor. I haven't decided yet whether to renovate and hold it or do something else entirely. What I know is that it's mine, that it was always mine, and that my father's certainty that he had taken it from me was wrong. Some things hold even when people spend a long time insisting otherwise. I still eat breakfast alone most mornings. Coffee, the news, whatever case file I'm working before I go in. But alone has never once felt like the word that was put on that screen next to my name in a resort ballroom in the Texas Hill Country. It never felt like that because it isn't that. I know the difference from the inside now and I am done letting anyone else's definition live in my house. I have work I'm good at. I have a friend who shows up with coffee at exactly the right moment. I have an aunt who stands beside me without being asked. I have a property on Llano Street that belonged to a man who believed in me when I was 12 years old and I am going to do something worthy of that belief. They called me a failure. They put it on a screen. They laughed. And I am sitting here today telling you this story from a life I built entirely on my own terms. So here is the only question I want to leave you with tonight. What is the one story someone told about you that you are still carrying as if it were true? Because the moment you put it down is the moment you find out how far you can actually go. I found out. And so can you. I'm just getting started. If this story made you feel something, don't just scroll away. There are so many stories out there that never get told. And here on Confire Stories we bring them to life. So if you enjoy emotional real-life drama like this, take a second to subscribe and be part of the journey. And if you've ever been in a situation like this, or have a story of your own, share it in the comments. I read them. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.